Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. This is the Bucky inspired Comprehensivity series to understand and change the world that we do in collaboration with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. This is the CJ Fernley project, and I think we're off to a great start. I am honored to have John and Yoshimi Brett from New Zealand presenting today on their idea of TetraMeme. So what the format is, we're going to have a presentation by these lady and gentlemen, and then we're going to open it up for any comments and questions. All right. So over to you, Yoshimi and John.
Okay, so welcome. Thank you for being here, because the more we talk to each other, the more we all learn, and John and I have so much to learn. So thank you. So I'm going to start our journey just to set some context in 4 minutes. So in long ago, in the 1970s, John and I sailed from here to the Marshall Islands, which is 7 degrees north of the equator. We went in his boat, 32-foot boat. Then we went to Japan and lived there for a couple of years. Then we went to San Diego, California, and got married. Then we came back in 1980 to Aotearoa, the land of the long white cloud, New Zealand, where that was in 1980. We learned from Old Chinese. And what Old Chinese taught us was his lessons from nature: earth, air, water, and fire. So fast forward 12 years, which is a very interesting number. 12 years later, in 1992, we were introduced to critical path, and we're very confused. Indeed. It's not, just a
not easy reading.
Not easy reading. And we started studying Bucky. We read Critical Path, and of course, we read Operating Manual. And so that was 1992. In 1995, we combined the wisdom of Old Chinese with Buckminster Fuller, and we brought them together. So in 1995 really is when TetraMap was born. So we began to spiral. It just spiraled, a spiral of evolution that popped out our baby TetraMap. This is a map: earth, air, water, fire, the 4 elements of nature, as described to us over many, 12 years of personal development study with the wisdom of Old Chinese. And then from 1992, the wisdom of Bucky and his total understanding of the principles of nature. And they all blend beautifully. So at the heart of TetraMap are nature's principles of diversity, interdependence, synergy, and procession. So in 2021, out pops TetraMeme. So very hard. We had no children. We had TetraMap, and this shape is very hard to give birth to, I can tell you. But thanks to Mother Nature, our 2 babies are TetraMap, earth, air, water, fire, and TetraMeme, also earth, air, water, fire. So thank you. First of all, I want to thank you so much for just being here and listening to us, because the more we can verbalize it, and this is something for all of us to learn, the more we can verbalize our ideas, the more we'll learn about ourselves, what we're trying to share, and about each other. So the beauty of TetraMap is that it is linear: earth, air, water, fire. It is binary. We looked at left brain, right brain, up, down, in, and out. And the important thing to remember is that we are all 4 elements. We are all earth as we solidify. We are all air as we transform. We are all water as we unify. And we are all fire, bright as we energize, all fire as we energize. So we wrote a book, as you do, and we facilitated thousands of facilitators to share and explore the strengths and differences between us in our behaviors, our motivations, our fears, and our actions. And that's what we did for 25 years. We facilitate mainly in corporate training, mainly with large organizations, large and small, not for profit, military. We worked with anyone who would sit down long enough to listen and be prepared to listen. So knowing that each of us is each element of nature, and I'm going to ask you to do this with me, okay? So like Earth, we solidify. This just helps us remember. Solidify.
Like try it with your hands.
Like this. Like air, we transform. Like water, we unify. And like fire, we energize. Like earth, we solidify. Like air, we transform. Like water, we unify. Like fire, we energize. Like water, we what? Like water, we unify. Like air, we what? Transform. Like earth, we what? Solidify. This is sort of Simon Says. Okay, fire. Fire energizes, water unifies, earth solidifies, air transform. Earth what? Solidifies. Air what? Transforms. Water what? Unifies. And fire what? Energizes. Right. Okay, because you're going to need to know that there's a test at the end, I think. Okay. So we linked all these earth, air, water, fire to principles that nature teaches us every day, and that Bucky dove into these principles and really gave it meaning and for us to understand what their significance. So diversity, interdependence, synergy that Peter did so well last week, and precession. Now, precession is a session all on its own, so we're not going to go into it, but that would be a fascinating session to cover, precession. So knowing that each of us is nature, knowing that each of us is nature, I am nature, we are nature. How do you solidify? How do you, in your personal and work life, transform? How do you solidify, and how do you energize? Okay, so I'll do that again. How do you solidify? How do you transform? How do you unify? And how do you energize? And I'd like you to think which ones of those words, earth, solidify, air, transform, water, unify, and fire, energize, which ones of those verbs do you do so well, so naturally? Because the beauty of groups is that we all have our strengths and we all have our passions. So just in the chat, would you just write down which one of those do you solidify, transform, unify, or energize? And you the most.
Because inevitably you do all of them.
You do all of them. But which one comes most naturally and just really fires you up? That you know you're doing a great job and you're making the difference you want to make. Okay, just put it in the chat. Can we see the chat?
Folks, go ahead and put, yeah, wonderful.
Just one word. Solidify, transform, unify, energize. Which one of those verbs, like Bucky says, we are a verb. I am a verb. Which one,
Oh,
which verb do
quite
you
a good
do?
variety.
Oh, great. Okay, can we just hear from one of you who put solidify?
Okay, who would like to go?
Someone who put, I didn't realize.
Go ahead. Go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like to speak. For each of them, just go ahead if you would like to speak. Let's go for Evanique. Evanique, go ahead.
Okay, so I solidify the most because I think it's just the nature of my field is that I look for the facts and I investigate the facts. So I'd solidify the facts. So that's why I put that.
Lovely.
Great. Anyone else?
Solidify. Okay, Penny, go ahead.
Okay, I put solidify because I am very family oriented and people oriented. And so I spend most of my time gathering people and taking care of people. And to me, that is solidifying the world.
Good.
Nice.
How about transform?
Who did transform?
Who would like to do transform? Go ahead and type an exclamation mark, please. Anybody for transform? We'll go with Paul. Paul, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's just my natural inclination to take one form and just sort of see where it moves. That's the best way I can put it.
Great. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank
Next
you.
up is Robert. Robert, go ahead.
I'm not unmuting. Now I'm unmuting.
Good on you, Robert.
I'm in for transform because I'm a designer and that's what designers do.
Great. Thanks. Good. Okay, how about unify?
Maritza.
I chose unify because I like to constantly preach the necessity for community and culture, and it makes me think of unity.
Nice.
Wonderful. Next up is Joe.
I select unify because I try to take another's perspective. And so I have kind of an empathetic, I initially put solidify in there. Yeah, I think that I empathize well with others. And I try and take their perspective.
Thank you. Next up is Richard. Richard.
Unmute.
Sorry about that. I chose unify because it represents the whole idea of unity is minimum two. It's always plural.
Yeah.
That's a good one. Unity is at minimum two. Thank you, Richard. How about energize?
Energize. Who is for energize? Judy, go ahead.
I chose energize because I'm always on the move and my ideas are flying all over the place like sparks. And I travel and I love moving around from place to place. And I like writing and reading and horseback riding and all kinds of things. You know, it's just like, I can't stop.
Wonderful.
Okay, is there anyone else?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Let's continue.
Okay, so right there in just a few minutes, we experienced and heard and saw earth, air, water, fire. Earth, air, water, fire. We saw people who naturally, their superpower is to solidify. and make things concrete for people, make things real for people. We saw people who transform and take like ephemeralization, you do all with nothing. You saw people, you met people who unify into community. And you saw people, and we heard people who energize and are just all over the place, like me, just all over the place. But the beauty is when people realize that our superpowers and our natural tendencies are so diverse, and then you put them all in the same room. So often in the corporate sector, the inability to recognize the beauty of that diversity is lost because people are so focused on getting the job done. So I would say probably that's how TetraMap helped the most, in that it helped people understand. We had more CEOs at the end of a workshop saying, I never realized I had such talented, intelligent, compassionate people working with me. And the keyword there is with, not for me. And so our job, our responsibility on this planet is to try to help people understand that nature, we are nature. And if we work with the principles of nature, we will be more interdependent and create more synergy. Okay, so thank you very much on that part.
Well, we're gonna continue with our.
We'll continue with
comparison.
our PowerPoint.
So you'd like to continue, Yoshimi?
Okay, so just to give you a review and a heads up. Oops, here. The distinctions, we're going to learn about TetraMeme from John. I gave you a taste of TetraMap. TetraMap is linear. The distinction will be that TetraMeme, what John will be presenting, is more spiral and cyclic. Oh, TetraMap is more about our going into relationships, our relationships with self and others from more of an ego perspective.
Understanding each other's ego.
Yeah, and we all have ego. It's just what we're trying to do with both our models is to go to ecotize our egos. Okay, so TetraMeme is more about what does actually eco relationships.
So more
mean?
bigger.
And for TetraMap, the principles, nature's and Bucky's principles, diversity, interdependence, synergy. TetraMeme will be
adds precession, because that's what happens in the context. Because of what you do, something else will happen as well. Not directly, but because you've done what you've done, other things will naturally happen.
So what we'll be asking you at the end of the session is, how might you develop a more eco-ego? That will be sort of the questions toward the end, and you'll have a better understanding of what you think your perception of eco relationships means.
So
Okay?
folks, we're going to have a very relaxed and very extensive comments and questions session. So please use pen and paper to keep track of all the thoughts that you have, all the questions that you have. We'll have plenty of time for it immediately after the presentation. Please go ahead, John and Yoshimi.
Okay, so TetraMeme really evolved during Buckminster Fuller Institute program back in 2021, when we joined a space camp mission called Nature Wisdom Institute, which was run by the couple down in the bottom left of the picture. TetraMeme evolved as we learned from the speakers of the program, while Luciana and Alex put these lessons into practice. They actually live in Brazil. Here's an example of a visualization of their intentions. It's quite complex, so there's no point in you trying to read it, but it gives you an idea of what they've.
Yeah, this is Luciana's original intent for her mission that engaged us, was to create an educational center in nature. That was her goal, and they're both architects. Luciana and Alex are both architects.
And then Ricardo, also in the group, has a farm in Venezuela. He did an excellent job doing his version of TetraMeme as well. So TetraMeme, so first of all, we're going to explore the foundations for TetraMeme. And then after that, I'll describe the TetraMeme process that results in these diagrams. So TetraMeme is an eco-centric approach to visioning. It's visualizing systemic relationships, trying to avoid the egocentric outcomes that normal planning tends to emphasize. TetraMeme lets good solutions emerge naturally, like the evolution of ecosystems. And what happens is we learn to expect serendipity, not what you would normally plan for, but serendipity is the result of synergy, where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. 1 + 1 = 4. And you'll remember this from Peter Myson's talk on synergy. 1 triangle + 1 triangle = 4 triangles. But what do you notice about the 2 triangles? Something important. So from his presentation, he showed you this from Bucky. Notice that the triangles are unfolding there. But if we see the whole page from Bucky's synergetics, see down the bottom, there's 2 bolts. They're the same length and the same diameter, but they're different. And it's the thread that's in a different direction. So there's the same kind of difference with the triangles is required. So 1 triangle plus a different triangle generates a tetrahedron. Now, I suspect it's a generalized principle that diversity is a prerequisite for synergy. I think this proves that. Not only does diversity fuel synergy, but it creates regenerative solutions. With 1 + 1 = 4, we doubled what we started with. And Buckminster Fuller said the tetrahedron is the minimum system in the universe.
Right. So this is the minimum system and consists of 4 minimum structures. Therefore, it's a minimum structural system in the universe. Boy, that ought to be something pretty important.
Yes, sir.
Wow.
Bucky, it should be.
Let's go, Jimmy.
It should be something pretty important because of the universal rule about nature works with the greatest economy.
Yeah.
So if you come to the minimum structure and the minimum system, you are now talking about the way nature works. That's what would make it something pretty important. Yes.
So important that it is all there is. Anything that we can point to.
It's so important it's all there is for anything we can point to. In other words, for any physical structure that we can see. Okay, so the tetrahedron is how nature works and a metaphor for how we can work in tune with nature. A solid tetrahedron has both an inside and an outside, thus we must consider the context. Vital. It also has 4 sides and 6 edges. Thus, consider the relationships between the different parts. It has no opposite sides, so we need to try and avoid polarized thinking like strengths and weaknesses. Let's just focus on strengths. And a solid tetrahedron has at least one side invisible. Thus, we must remember to consider the implicit behind what we see. So now I'm about to start an overview of the TetraMeme process, but I'd like to relate it to CJ's basic design cycle, especially with the idea of emergence. The TetraMeme process is really designed to help us completely surrender to emergence by focusing on what we desire in terms of the inherent potential of the context. In other words, eco-centric desires rather than egocentric desires. And then work on actions that could improve the interdependent relationships. So the tetrahedron has 4 sides, but you cannot see all sides. As we spin the tetrahedron, it's clear that each side touches every other side, and no 2 sides are opposite. Interdependence is explicit. However, when we unfold the tetrahedron, it unfolds into TetraMeme. TetraMeme focuses on functions or roles that proceed in a spiral progression starting from the center. All 4 elements are now explicit, but the interdependent relationships between them are now implicit. Note, however, that the placement of elements may change depending on the sequence of unfolding. The TetraMeme process has 4 main phases, starting with fire in the center. The first phase is looking at the potential or the inherent potential of the context outside the project. And then the second phase is a metaphor which solidifies the project based on examples from nature. Third phase is about relationships, not with people, but how the different elements of the project complement each other. The 4 sides of the tetrahedron represent the elements or parts of the project, and the 6 edges represent the relationships or interdependencies between elements. For example, how or what does the project both unify and energize? So the strength of a tetrahedron depends on the strengths of the relationships between the different sides. That's just like the strength of a team depends on the strengths of the relationships between its members, team of people. The 4th phase is action. And then we document the actions that could strengthen each relationship and potentially transform the project. And then we also must consider the feedback systems or key performance indicators that you can use to monitor the success of your actions. Good feedback loops are vital to any stable ecosystem. So that's the TetraMeme process. And here is a TetraMeme we created. It visualizes the benefits of Zenit 100, which is a voluntary building performance standard that we achieved here with our house, where we generate twice as much energy as we use. And so we contribute the excess to the national grid, effectively leaving water in the dams and coal in the ground, and a bunch of other really good social reasons, social benefits as well. So in review,
so TetraMeme is unlike TetraMap, which is linear. We start with linear with TetraMap because it's easy for people to understand. Because at the end of the day, this, which is TetraMap, earth, air, water, fire, folds up into a tetrahedron, right? So we start with, this is a very easy learning part. We both have education background, so this was a great way, and we spent 25 years on this, to people engage quickly because we always start with nature. But at the end of whatever workshop we're doing, we always go back to, but this is more like reality. This helps you understand why you behave the way you do. But the reality is this, it's far more complex. But TetraMeme, and this is very egocentric because it's about me, it's about understanding my ego and your ego and how they blend, etc. But TetraMeme looks at the eco relation, the ecological relationships by using the tetrahedron. Both models still, again, I keep going back to nature and Bucky's principles: diversity, interdependence, synergy, and precession. So what we've shared with you are sort of how what we've created, TetraMap and TetraMeme, have evolved. The greatest learning that we'll all have in this room is to start with self. And that's the beauty of any facilitation. If you can get the people to personalize immediately, great learnings will emerge. So the question we ask, oops,
the next one.
I know this one. The question, yep.
You're talking about eco-relationships.
Oh, is about eco-relationships. So when we say eco-relationships, we are nature, I am nature, you are nature, we are nature. So what are our relationships? One, with self. What's my relationship with self, which is very important. Then what's my relationship with one other? Then and then you grow it out. Keep people safe. In any facilitation, it helps to keep people safe by starting with self and then one other, rather than throw them into a big saying, so how do you feel, in a group of 12 or 20 or whatever. So we look at eco-relationships, and then most importantly, our relationships with nature.
And that's all of life.
And that's all of life, to make the world work. For 100%, all of life. So the question we leave you with, as we do ourselves too, how might I develop a more eco-ego? It's easy to remember, eco-ego and ecological ego, to make the difference that I want to make. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. If we could stop sharing the screen, we'll have different people. So folks, go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like to make any comments, or if you have questions, or if you would like to answer this question. I'm going to start off with one intriguing thing that you brought up, that the difference, there was a set of principles in both sides, and the principle that was added on one side was precession. So could you talk briefly about precession?
Sure. Precession, Bucky likes to give the example of a bee going to get nectar from a flower, and so his intention is to get food, but the result is he also legs that gather pollen, and the body gathers pollen, he ends up pollinating the plants as well. So the precession is happening kind of at right angles, or not the original intention. Another example is when you're riding a bike and you want to turn left, you immediately automatically heel over to the left. That's the physical expression of precession. You didn't intend to heel over like that, it just happened. You can actually do the opposite. You can heel over and then steer. So precession is slightly different from synergy in that, in theory, it's predictable, but often it's really an effect of the context that you're in, and usually in a complex situation, the precessional effects are so complex that there's no way you're ever going to predict them.
An example of precession is the horrors of war and developing weapons. But after the war, but with that technological development in future, that technology was used for peace, was never intended for peace. It was intended for war. So Bucky pays a lot of attention to this, to actually planning, and we did with our clients. Can we actually plan for precession? And in one sense, in the 80s, it was scenario thinking. But what was missing, I think, in those scenario thinking and all those models was it must serve nature. And we're at that point in time that every possible processional outcome, that means a consequence from where we're going, must be considered. And if it's not adding value to nature, we're not on path. We must start to recognize faster when we're not on path. And one way to do that is consider all the processional consequences that may come from creating plastics. They didn't consider what might be the processional outcomes. So plan for procession and always keep in mind it must serve nature.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. So folks, go ahead and type an exclamation mark if you would like to offer comments, you would like to answer the question or raise any question. We're going to start with Richard. Richard, go ahead.
Oh, good.
Yeah, thank you. I was going to start out with my journey, which starts in the 1970s when I first was introduced to Bucky, but I'll skip right back up to procession because procession has been a very important thing for me and my work, which has been in social work. And one of the things that we were also trying to do is how do you marry context or the systemic with the methodology or the systematic or the linear. And I've created a model that can do that. And procession then became an important part of trying to understand what happens when somebody is trying to help somebody else to move from, if you want, a problem to a solution. So my understanding of Fuller and the example that you gave with the bee and the pollination is that there's an axis between the bee and the flower. And what happens is in the bee then moving over to another flower and pollinates that flower, what happens is that there's a movement that's perpendicular 90 degrees to the axis of the relationship. So that meant for me that if I had a helper and somebody needing help in a relationship, an axis, and they worked back and forth, they didn't push or pull each other, they worked back and forth, they created motion that was perpendicular to that axis that went from problem to solution. And out of that procession, the helper then became good at whatever he or she was doing. So their desire probably is to be a good helper, which is accomplished. And the person receiving the help wanted to get help with a problem that they couldn't solve on their own. So they got there. And that, to me, ended up being the meaning of synergy, that you put two or more things together to create something that neither one could have achieved on their own. And that's one of the definitions of synergy and why it's so important in order for us not to be judgmental or not to take over the dynamics of something, not to play out the expert role, all of those kinds of things. Not that we don't have experts, but we don't do what Bucky was always basically even lecturing us against, and that was the idea of the route to heaven, if you want, is through specialization, and he was dead against that. And you used the example of war, and one of the things that Bucky taught me about the generalist and the specialist and them working together, but it's not the specialist that runs the ship. So he asked one question. He said, thinking of war, tell me who runs the war? Who's the top person? What's their title? And very often people will say, well, they're called generals. Yeah, right. The general runs the big system, And the specialists, the gunners and whatever else, they do what the general tells them to do. So I taught generalist social work, but a lot of students just wanted to get out of there and get to a master's level. So I used to say to them, well, if you stay at the generalist level, one day you're going to be in charge of the agency, and you're going to hire all these specialists to work for you. So I said, go and have a barroom discussion with your master student colleagues and see what happens in the evening. So anyway, that's my starting thoughts vis-a-vis procession.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And later on, if you want to add anything, feel free to do that. Just go ahead and type exclamation mark. Let's go. Folks would love to hear from all of you. So next up is Joe.
Fantastic presentation. It was really, I mean, there's a lot to cover here. So I'm just going to start with covering maybe a couple of parts that I see where there's connections. I think we actually had a conversation here last night about systems thinking and understanding the self, and how becoming self-aware is absolutely critical. And because you start to understand your role in the system. And what I really like is how you related this to diversity. Because what you want is as many perspectives as possible, and you want as much feedback as possible to understand yourself and how you relate to different peoples, different skill sets within an organization, and how an organization relates to itself, so that you start to see all these connections within one another. And I think that that's, to me, and it comes back to that unifying principle of water that we were talking about a little bit earlier. And you can see how these all fit together. You know, so many times it's true that specialization is something that, you know, pigeonholes us and kind of makes us think in one direction. However, understanding the specialist perspective and each specialist perspective is very important as far as actually starting to integrate and connect the dots. And so I can see how this fits both within an eco-friendly kind of situation, but also in every aspect of life. If you walk into an organization, it's the same thing. You mentioned about how you were consulting for various companies. This is a major problem, is that they become very siloed. And in order to break down those silos, you actually have to understand the values of the organization. And then you have to be able to integrate everybody's, under perspective in order to make it work as the whole. So I think that that's one area that it comes together. Another way is that once you have a better understanding, you can start to solidify from there, because what that allows you to do is allows you to simplify. When you start to see all different parts of an organization, you start to see what you need and what you don't need, what you can disregard and what you should keep, what is essential. And again, this all requires you to get as many different perspectives as possible and integrate as much information as possible. I see the fire, I see how all of these work together, and then ultimately you can lead a transformation from that perspective. So, you have the fire, the energy, that's the diverse, groups that you put together, then the solidification of that, and the transformation, and then the interdependence that you have as a whole. So I think the model is absolutely fantastic, and that we can actually, and we're just scratching the surface here as to how to think about this. I mean, this is a very, very deep way of approaching transformation, or any kind of change. And again, it comes back, and I like the question that you start with, is the question of the self. Because if you don't understand yourself, you can't understand anything else. If you're not self-aware, somebody actually once told me, he said, if, in just a random occurrence, he just said, if you don't love yourself, you can't love anyone else. And there's a truth to that, because you have to understand, like, what is it about yourself that you really care about, or that you do well. Another person actually does this, and we've talked about this here in the past at 52 Living Ideas, is Ray Dalio, where he talks about surrounding yourself with individuals that don't necessarily have the same skill sets that you are, that complement where you're weak. And so and he has a whole ranking system that goes along with that, and how to identify what your strengths are, what your weaknesses are, and how you interact as a whole. And I think, understanding your personality and how it works with other personalities. And Shrikant is actually, maybe even might want to talk about the example where he, sat all the introverts together at one point at one table, and maybe not right now, but at some point where, the individual personalities were all kind of grouped together, and how that maybe didn't necessarily work together as it did with as much as having diverse groups to work together at a meetup, as they started complementing each other. So this is a fantastic model. I love it. There's a lot of fun you can have with it. And I think it's, it really is the basis of transformation. And it's interesting to see, again, how the tetrahedron fits into, kind of allows us to see the whole. And it's anyway, I'll leave it at that for now. We can, but there's more I can definitely, I want to come back to.
Wonderful.
Yeah, we have
So
time.
John and Yoshimi, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that it's really the TetraMeme process is a model, sure, but TetraMeme is really more than just that model. It's an approach. So it can apply in many different ways, and really it's the principles behind it that are most important, and the model itself, the triangular frame, is just a way to express some of the approach.
What's not in, for TetraMap, there's heaps of leader guides and facilitator guides and so forth, and certification programs. TetraMeme, we were retired, and we created it because we wanted to create something that was free to everybody. We have a business with TetraMap, but TetraMeme is. But what I'm learning, and we just had a guest from the United States leave yesterday. We've had 2 guests from the United States in the last 2 weeks. And what comes to me, and the last guest was very politically diverse from our perspectives of politics and so forth. So, but what it boiled down to was values. What it boiled down to was, what do you value? What do I value? And are those values reflected in the leaders that you choose to follow? What's their definition? We must learn about what are the values of the people we are following. And as followers, really challenge to, are they living those values? And what's at the heart of all that, and the self-reflection, is trust. If we don't, what I found in speaking to this woman, she didn't trust anybody, and she listed all the US TV news stations. I said, well, we don't watch any of them. But she goes, well, I don't trust any of them. I said, well, until you trust yourself, well, I didn't say it to her, but I was saying, until you trust yourself, she's not going to ever trust. So at the heart of with the 4 principles and the tetrahedron, one must first trust self, and then trust the person next to you, and then let it expand. But that whole concept of what I think we've lost so much of in everything because of our global situation is trust. So our job as facilitators of change is to, how do we engage people to explore how they might trust themselves and therefore trust that they are a part of nature.
And going beyond people, TetraMeme is about trusting that a solution will emerge rather than having to feel that I've designed a solution and we're going to get there. So you've got to trust
Keep
me.
going. Sorry.
Next.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is Penny, followed by Richard. Folks, if you would like to ask questions, make comments, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Penny, go ahead.
Okay. First, I had just a question. I know you said that we needed an ecocentric approach to visioning, and I think you said that in the past it's been more egocentric. Is that what you said?
Correct.
Works fine.
So egocentric, I mean, typically we say, well, what do you want? You plan the future. What is the future you want? All right. So you put a stake in the ground. So I want this, and then you figure out, you plan how to get there with as little damage as possible. It's about what I want. Whereas an eco approach is to say, well, it's not what I want. What does the system want? In fact, what does not only my project, what does the outside my project want? What does the bigger system that we are nested within want? And work on that. That's understanding the eco-centric requirements rather than my egocentric requirements.
Yeah, thank you. And I thought that, I mean, I'm kind of new in this like with Bucky and stuff, but when you were saying about how could you develop a more ego, I mean, I thought maybe the first step was almost the first thing that you said is always remember that we are part of nature.
Yeah.
And so if you're taking that viewpoint, okay, I'm part of nature. So then I think, you tend to have a much more global view about what should be happening. I've always tried to be eco-conscious, but I didn't necessarily think of myself so much as part of nature. I was trying not to, recycle and waste things and stuff like that. But somehow, if you think you're part of nature, it seems much more proactive to me. Like what I am doing makes a difference because I'm part of nature, the same as everybody else.
Exactly. And how can we work with nature rather than fighting nature all the time? So I like to use the example of an umbrella. When I put an umbrella up for the rain, I'm not fighting nature. I'm not fighting the rain. I'm just protecting myself and living with rain. So it's the same thing with the virus. We need to learn to protect ourselves and live with the virus.
Thank you. Next up is going to be, sorry, Penny, are you, okay, very good. Next up is going to be Richard, followed by Maritza. Richard.
Yeah, so I'm back to the journey that you've been on, and there's a parallel in terms of my journey. I actually go back to the 1960s when I was first taught about systems thinking at McGill University in Montreal. And one of the definitions of system at that time, or the basic definition, was that it's a set of interacting parts, which was interesting. But I got to a point where I was then saying, well, how many parts does it take to make a system? And nobody could answer me. I got answers all over the map. And so for 10 years, I was interested in systems, but could never get the answer to that question. Then in 1975, when synergetics first came out, and I started to wade my way through that book, I all of a sudden found the definition of a system that had a definite answer. And it didn't matter to me whether it was the right answer or the wrong answer. It was, Bucky was definite. It's 4. Then I learned about the tetrahedron. I learned about the solid tetrahedron. And I learned about the two triangles, which is interesting because what you do is open up a triangle like you might open up a paper clip. And so you move a two-dimensional triangle, you slide those two together and you end up with a three-dimensional figure, which happens to be a tetrahedron. And that was my first proof of the old saying that says a whole is more than the sum of its parts. But it was for me in my field a bunch of rhetoric because there was no evidence. But now when I could show students 1 + 1 = 4 in terms of the triangles, then I had my proof. The other, and I'll just stop in a minute here, with the other thing that has been a challenge for me is the relationship part between the faces of the solid tetrahedron. And you can't see the relationships, just the way you were describing that in a certain way, you can't see one of the four faces. So what I did when I laid down the tetrahedron from its three-dimensional back to its two-dimensional, so you see what you have presented, then I pulled those triangles apart. And that way, then the 6 interconnection relationships surfaced. And now you could see them. And that's, again, one of the problems we have in my field in social work is that when you're working with humans in their relationships between themselves and other systems, you talk about relationships, but we can't see relationships. If I'm building a bridge, a suspension bridge, I can see the cable, which is the relationship that the tension that holds the columns together. If I was working in anatomy, I could see the ligaments that keep the bones in place without touching. But in social relationships, you can't see the invisible. So you have to have a metaphor that tries to bring that to the surface. And then you can talk about focusing, being centered on relationships and not on entities, or not on nature all by itself, or not on you all by yourself. You focus on what's going on in between. And that's what I think eco-ego is all about. So anyway, that's it's an exciting to sort of parallel our respective journeys over much the same period of time.
Yeah.
What
Amazing.
we did in every workshop, almost every workshop we did, each person gets 3 pens. Okay, so you give them sticks, you give them toothpicks. Does take a lot. And say, okay, my triangle and your triangle make 4 triangles. And that's a great icebreaker. And they eventually come up with this, right? This shape. And it only takes the exercise. Some people take a bit longer, but you just do tell them to do market research and look at the next table or whatever. So that's very simple, 6 sticks, and they could make a tetrahedron. When you get to the next level and you get into more deeper understanding of synergy, then you'll have to demonstrate this with somebody. Okay, you said it.
Yeah, so the key here is that Yoshimi can lift her right hand. Face it a little bit forward. Okay. She can lift her right hand, and if I lift my right hand, we can't work to create a tetrahedron. I have to lower my right hand, and then I can just go straight in. You point your thing at mine there, and you can see the tetrahedron.
So they must be different.
But it's hard to visualize, and that's the challenge. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've gone down the linear route, the binary route of cubes, where you've got opposites, and we love brain loves binary, because it's just so hard to see tetrahedrons and their relationships. But that's the way nature works.
Wonderful. So folks, people who have not spoken before will get a chance to speak first. So if you're not spoken, go ahead and type !. So it's going to be Maritza, Paul, and Joe. Oh, wait a minute, Richard, you had something.
Well, I was going to say, I want to tell you just a very quick story. When I was teaching students about Tetrahedron, those are the kinds of reactions you would get, that people couldn't understand it and they were frustrated. I had a student at the end of the fall term, so fed up with what I was doing, she went home to her sister's place, and she was complaining about the professor and this stupid model that they were playing with. So her sister said, "Don't worry about it. We can do a little sort of occupational therapy, and come on down to the church this afternoon. We're making little Christmas tree hangings." So they went down there, and guess what they were doing? They were making tetrahedron Christmas balls, and she had to make them all afternoon. She came back. I still have one of them. It might be in front of me. She came back to my office in January, and she says, "You will not believe what I had to do." And she threw this thing at me. But I suspect tetrahedrons have been in her head ever since.
I call that serendipity. That's what you expect. We can expect when we do things in tune with nature.
Beautiful.
Next up is Maritza, Paul, Evanique, and Joe. Maritza.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. It was so packed with so many things I'm still processing, but I did have a question. You brought up the consequences at the end there, and I get a little bit on my soapbox about the consequences and how in today's society we're so very much divorced from this the fact that every action has a consequence. And I was curious, looking at the 4 phases of the TetraMeme, do we assume that the consideration for consequences should be interwoven into each phase? Or is there one in particular where it's most necessary or important to consider the consequences?
Good question. I think the key thing really is that when you're doing the first context questions, the potential, looking at the potential of in the context. So if you're thinking about your project, let's call it a project. It could be lots of different things, but we'll call it a project. So that has an inside and it has an outside. So you look at outside the project. That's where you want to make a difference. That's where you want consequences. What you do there, though, is you're looking at the inherent potential of the context. What would be better out there? And so that gives you the kind of the why. Often those are unattainable aspects, or there'll be you can move the needle a little bit, but it's really important that it goes in a trend in a particular direction. That's really the consequences that you're aiming for. Is it becomes an eco-centric desire, a desire for something outside what you're actually focused on. And then at the project level, where you're trying to work out what you're actually going to do, instead of having tangible outcomes, you work on improving relationships. So the outcome is, the consequence is a better all these better improved relationships. And you don't know what the outcomes of those consequences of those improved relationships are, but you can expect serendipity and synergy.
Which requires trust. Those two, for synergy and just the belief that of the definition of synergy. And that is what you asked was so wonderful, because as a facilitator of change, our responsibility is to also include, to set the context definitions. So nature is a beautiful metaphor that you can teach, explain interdependence, diversity, synergy, and precession. You could use the B, or, understand how those four principles, I could do it right, diversity, interdependence, synergy, and precision, understand it in your own mind. And as you set the context for your meeting, your project, your whatever, use nature, because no one has ever thrown back the nature metaphor. We start every workshop, we just have pictures, beautiful pictures of natures from calendars we've ripped up over many years. And they just pick one, and how is this, pick a scene that reflects your nature at home, or you could say at work. It depends on the context of the class. How does this reflect? And no one ever, might get one or two people going like this, but they eventually join in. So right at the beginning, in setting the context of your meeting, give them an opportunity to connect with nature, because they will never, oh, this makes me feel good because blah, 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 blah. And then they're already connecting. And then, oh, how does my picture compare to your picture? Then you're starting to do this. And I'm starting to learn about you, and you're starting to learn about me. So before you ask the question about precision, make sure they understand what precision means. And you can do that in setting your context. Yeah.
And this session is a great example of creating something and having a trust that the consequence of this event will be useful. We have no idea how or what, but we have an intention for it to improve the relationships we have with, some of the knowledge and with people. I mean, I've been wanting to talk to Richard for a while, because when I read what he was doing, I think, gosh, he's gone down such a similar track. We have so much in common, and we finally got an opportunity to do this, and that's just serendipity.
All right. Let's see. I think Joe had a very quick comment, and then we'll go to Paul, followed by Evanique. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to build on what you just said, because I think it's actually critical. One of the most important parts that I've seen that you've been able to do with the tetrahedron is actually create the spiral that answers what you just talked about here with the why. And then from there, you have the what and the how. And then you have the actions that you're taking place. And then you have the feedback systems that come within that. And that's actually a very, very elaborate process that you've been able to capture within the tetrahedron. And what that does is it comes in and starts with is something that we've talked a lot about in the design way, is the idea of intention. So you start with the intent that you're actually, why you're doing something in the first place. And then this also allows you to assess capabilities, infrastructure, all these other things that you need to understand in order to actually make meaningful changes. But the spiral that you've created is absolutely beautiful, because it captures everything that you need to do in order to have that process also improve itself in a regenerative way, because you have the feedback loop that's coming back, and you're constantly asking yourself the why. And many times when you see organizations that drift, that they often drift from the why. They forget as to what they're doing something, as to why it exists in the first place. So that is, kind of follows on to what you were just saying. But I think that was one of the most impressive things about the model itself, is how much it captures in a very simple, in a simplified form, in the tetrahedron form. So yeah, I mean, that was a very complex thing, because then you can even add a lot of analytics to that and assign values to that. And so, yeah, there's a lot that can be done. So that was really important.
Although the spiral is complex, what makes it easy is we're cycling through the 4 elements every time. It's the same 4 elements again and again. So you're building that metaphor, becomes more and more, useful, and helps you the four elements help you chunk information. You can chunk things together into one big chunk to make sense of it, and you can chunk one big piece into lots of little pieces that make sense. It's a really good tool.
It's
Thank you.
interdependent.
Thank you. Thank you. Next up is going to be Paul, followed by Evanique. Paul.
Yeah, thank you so much. The reason I think this whole thing is so important for all of us is it's like the biggest challenge right now in this world with the rate of change going on is learning a method of structuring the massive inflow of constant change that we are, because of the speed of technology and the speed of information, and if you don't have any structure, and Srikant, gives us the opportunity to study the Tao and the Bhagavad Gita and John, but those things somehow still don't, for some people, don't find, but the challenge of, they don't find it a way they can take the incoming and do something with it that keeps them sane. But so I thank you for this attempt at that. But my questions are regarding the challenges of the tetrahedron and things. I had one of my hardest courses in college. I was just trying to satisfy a requirement, and I took crystallography. Now, I'll always be happy that I took crystallography, but man, was it hard. And I think part of it was hard because my, what they call spatial intelligence is just not that great. So you seem to be able to have to envision all these symmetries and then do the math and understand the geometry. It was really hard. So that's one reason I see why you're trying to do all these techniques. But my question, I have a question around that, okay? In one of Srikant's wonderful presentations, this crazy guy, I say that in a beautiful way, Stroopy, showed us all these spheres. And so somehow the idea of a tetrahedron as 4 spheres could be a whole nother way of teaching and talking about it. And I just would like your observations about that, because somehow I find it more amenable to my mind with the little edges that are kind of touching here and there, and all those things transform from points and lines to those packed spheres. I would like your observations on that. And secondly, one quick question, and then I'll shut up, which is, I'm into mental health and counseling and things. So in your workshops, when you talk about starting with the self, do you actually map the tetrahedron to consciousness, the pieces of internal consciousness that we all have that are earth, air, fire, and water? Or how do you approach applying the ideas you're talking about to the ones in internal consciousness? Thank you.
Okay, good question. I'm going to leave Yoshimi to explain
What?
the earth, air, water, fire of consciousness of, of people, the way we think from the TetraMap. But I wanted to show you the visualization of the tetrahedron. So, if you pull out this this thing here, I don't know if you'll recognize this as a crystal structure.
It might give me nightmares, but I kind of remember that kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So the cool thing is that this is the shape of, this is a carbon atom. And at the end is another carbon atom, another carbon atom, another carbon atom, and another carbon atom. Then that is diamond, which is the hardest naturally occurring system material on the planet. It's just carbon in a tetrahedron lattice. The other thing about this is if you put 4 hydrogens on there, so 1 carbon and 4 hydrogens, you get the molecule called methane, which is for New Zealanders is our biggest bugbear because it's our largest carbon emission problem with agriculture, because most of our power we get from renewable power. But if you tack on more of these, replace the hydrogen with another carbon with a bunch of hydrogens, you get fuel and you get protein and you get us. All matter, all life is made up of basically this structure. Yeah, so it's so real, but it is hard to see, but you know, you can play around with it and it's really handy if it squeaks. And Yoshimi, you want to
Well, you know,
talk about
big picture, the I think,
the consciousness?
well, I don't know your answer
Oh,
is. My
okay.
answer is different, so you go ahead.
Well, quickly, the consciousness, yeah, with the way we use TetraMap is to think of, you know, really people think in different ways. So if you think, we have all four elements, all right? So these two elements, think more left brain, practical, left brain, yeah, and whereas these two elements are more right brain, people oriented in terms of consciousness. These outside elements are more externally focused, not necessarily egos, yeah, and internally focused. And then these two elements are more down-to-earth practical, where these two are more conceptual, abstract, conceptual. And then you can get distinctions with the combinations and so on. And the whole point is that when you fold it up, at this point, I might be coming across as very air, and that's what you're seeing. But I've still got all these other elements. You just don't necessarily see them at any one particular time. If you're lucky, you might see me being 3 elements at one time, but you'll never see me being all 4 elements at one time. So we use the tetrahedron and the unfolded tetrahedron. So this is the TetraMap, and then the TetraMeme is that, you know, unfolded slightly differently to try and visualize how things are different and try and visualize the relationships. So you can see the relationships between these elements in a very linear way, but you have to remember that they are actually all interdependent. It's not at all obvious from that. So we have to remember both. So we need to find, I like to think of, you know, the saying, I'll believe it when I see it. So if we can express it in words, great, but we have to find a way to show it. And
I'll see it when I believe it. I guess the way I would approach that is stepping back. And we've worked with a lot of mental health practitioners, not with the actual patients, but with the practitioners. And I think that's where it needs to start, because the practitioners, the schools of nursing and whatever, that where their clientele are people at risk with serious problems who need to, but the teachers, if they understand TetraMap, if they understand that they are nature, how would they strategize? Each patient is diverse, each patient is different, each patient will not fall into earth, air, water, fire, might be all 4, but if they understand earth, air, water, fire, preferences, motivations, fears, particularly fears, and now there's a lot of fear on this planet. Every element has different fears. Every element has different strengths. And the only way we're going to get synergy is if we work together. So the highlight of our workshops, yes, we start with, look at this picture, how does it relate? How do you relate to it? And what aspects of it reflects your nature? We share, we do it in 4s. But when they really get it is when we divide, they do a short instrument that's part of the process. And they get into their groups, and each group answers the same question. How do I prefer to be approached and not approached? And how do I add value to team. Those two questions, how do I prefer to be approached and how do I add value? Every single presentation is totally different. So I always start with water because they are the least, they hate public speaking. They hate getting up in front of a group. They're tend to be more shy. So I put them up first and we give them a big round of applause and we give them support. Before that, though, we've built trust that they can be, and we have had workshops where the water elements have spent an hour on the stage with tears and the whole lot saying, I'm hoping by sharing with you how I add value will actually, that you listen to this because you never listened to me in the office. So it's when a person, like you said, sees it in the physical, but it's got to be a human physical. This, for some people, they can't, shapes, they just draw a blank because it's related to math. Well, a lot of people, how many people on this work, including me, that you see numbers and you don't understand. Your belief is you don't understand. So make it real by making, wow, when the earth elements in the audience are watching water present, they're going, oh my gosh, no wonder. It's a no wonder situation. And when a person says, well, no wonder, I never realized, then you're starting to shift mindsets and getting an appreciation of diversity.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Yoshimi. Thank you, John. Next up, and great questions, Paul. Next up is going to be Evanique, followed by Richard. Evanique.
Thank you, John and Yoshimi, for this talk today. When you were both creating the tetrahedron, and and John had to lift his right arm, and I think you had to lift your left arm, and I was thinking of that in terms of relationships, and that, and in the essence of the elements that you were talking about. Earth, air, fire, water, and solidifying, transformation, energizing, and unifying. I was thinking of that in terms of relationships, and there's a give and take. And, I always wondered, like, what does this have to do with relationships? And tonight it really solidified for me that you need, if people studied this and really took the time to understand this, they will understand where their strengths lie and be able to shine where they need to shine and support. I would like to call it supporting where they need to support. In other words, take the back burner and let someone else lead. And I think you did the classic example of water. Water would never want to go up to the stage. And water is unifying. But, no one was listening to water because, they were worried about themselves. And I think especially in corporate America, when you have teams and people are still trying to shine, they're trying just to get their promotion or whatever, they're going for their own interest. They don't see how those other people could help them get to where they want to go so much easier than them trying to do it themselves. So there's not really a formative question, but it's just more of a revelation that you can use people with other talents to get you where you need to go, and to have that not be a dirty word or not a dirty thing, because you can also help them get to where they need to go. And it's it's a relationship, it's synergy. It's just, so thank you. That's all I want to say.
Thank you. You got it.
Yeah, I think also that often people find there's an abrasive part of other people that when they see it in the whole with the tetrahedron and unfolded into the elements, and they suddenly realize what annoys them is actually a strength that they have. Just I don't have that strength, but they have that strength, and it's not always appropriate. That's why it really annoys me, because I generally work in a field where that strength is not useful. But if I was in that, you know, a different set of circumstances, that person could be a real ally. And that's why the TetraMap approach of looking at the value of each of the different elements really helps you get over your initial reactions of dislike or, you know, things that behavior that annoys you, and realize, oh, that could be a behavior that would be useful in a different context. Again, we go back to context. Context is everything.
You can learn more. We do have a couple of master facilitators in Florida and other places. So if you just go to TetraMap.com, there is a US connection.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Richard, followed by Joe. Folks, if anybody else wants to comment or ask questions, go ahead and type ! Richard.
Well, I guess my first comment on what you just said is that I do hope you get the governor of Florida into one of those workshops. One of the things that was interesting for me is that the way I've been working with the Tetrahedron over the years has been largely in social work, but also in suicide prevention. And we discovered when we were teaching suicide intervention in a corporate kind of environment, what came out of it was all of these kinds of improved communications that you were just talking about. And so we kind of joked about it, saying that, you know, a lot of the corporate problems have to do with communications, and they often bring in communication experts. And that, I'm sure that's offensive to staff. But we said, well, if you've got a communication problem, bring us in to teach suicide prevention and you'll get your communication problem solved. And so I'm just thinking that you might be doing the same thing when you say that, well, we'll help you with the communication, but don't bring us in as the communication expert, bring us in as the TetraMap, whatever. And out of it, they'll end up getting improved communication, and they won't even know that that's what you were up to in the first place.
Exactly. We did exactly that with the Singapore Armed Forces. They came to us and said, do you teach creativity? And we said, sure.
I'm fire. I say yes to everything.
So we created a creativity, and it's just about communication and valuing each other's differences, working together to come up with something that's amazing. You know, the whole idea of 1 + 1 = 4 is that when you have diversity, you can create something that's unimaginable. Well, people are not used to that. They think, okay, we've got to build on, you know, keep on scaffolding things together and thinking in cubes. You've got to put these cubes on top. But if you get diversity working together, you can create amazingly new things. Yeah, wonderful.
Well, it's also with this idea of thinking out of the box, which is out of the notion of squares and cubes. Some people might say, well, okay, I'm going to think out of the box, but you know, what kind of thinking do I have to do? And the answer could be, well, now think in triangles, see what happens. And here's a quiz for all of us to see what was taught in our grade schools. If I put a triangle, you could draw a triangle right in front of you or just in your head. And if I asked you the question, what's the sum of the angles of that equilateral triangle? My guess is that most of you will end up saying 180. And so you've added up the inside triangles. And if I told you it was wrong, it should be 1080. And once you grasp it, then you realize, oh my gosh, yeah, there's the outside triangle or angles as well. And so it's 1080, 360 times 3. And all of a sudden, people then realize that we've been taught to think about only me, inside my town, my country, my whatever. And it was grade 3 mathematics that taught us to think that way. So it's a tough one to get out of. And I really thank you for the way you're approaching it and the way you're doing it with the people you work with and what you're now giving out for free. Wow, that's beautiful.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Joe. Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that was interesting just thinking about it is actually maybe drawing an organizational chart in a triangle as opposed to little boxes, as they like are usually set up like a taxonomy almost. And then you could start to see the disconnections as opposed to seeing the connections themselves. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. One of the things that I was actually had a question about, maybe you can elaborate on a little bit more, is that how the feedback loops and the actions relate to ephemeralization, because that it seems to be a direct relationship there, that you have to be able to understand how the actions are interacting with one another in order to reduce to what's a minimal amount of action that is needed to be taken. So the energy that's almost going through a system, in order to see how the parts are interacting with one another, how do you reduce that? And if you don't have that communication that's going on, then ephemeralization kind of at least slows down. It doesn't work as efficiently. So I was like wondering if you maybe can expand upon that aspect of it, because I think that that's a really important part, is understanding how not only the how, the what's, and then the actions, but the actions themselves, and being able to capture that feedback loop, as we've talked about, how that directly relates to efficiency and ephemeralization.
Yeah, good question. I'm thinking back to our experience with the Nature Wisdom program, Nature Wisdom Institute. And what happened was they had a lot, they're starting off with this vague concept, and they wanted to make it real. And they had a lot of different choices. And they were struggling to do, because it's so complex, it's struggling to make any difference. And when they did the TetraMeme, it helped them see, okay, these are the important things, especially from the context, looking at the potential of the context. This is what is really important. And then you suddenly start to realize, if I focus on that particular thing that's really important, these other things are going to happen anyway. So that's the kind of ephemeralization. It doesn't actually happen down at the relationships and actions level. It happens right up front at the context, looking at the context potential level. And that's, at that point, that enables all of that ephemeralization, I think. But there probably is ephemeralization later too. I haven't really thought about it.
Yeah, it's so good to be with people who understand Bucky. We always had a poster up, Bucky quotes. Nature is exquisitely efficient. And we have a beautiful picture of a butterfly, and nature. But if you just examine a couple of Bucky's quotes like that, what does exquisitely efficient mean? What is truly exquisitely efficient? Are we exquisitely efficient? Is our team exquisitely efficient? We did one 3-hour session, and all I did was say, what are we wasting? Well, we had like a dozen flip charts filled top to bottom, and each group did flip charts. One was on time, one was on resources, one was on talent, one was on resources, one was on opportunities. When we just take that one word, that one question, what are we wasting? I think we will come to reveal the reason we're in the mess we're in. Because we have, as humanity, wasted so much because we didn't, there's always excuses, that's the way it was. So what are we going to do about it now? how are we going to address, it's not blaming, yeah, we were raised in the 60s and we loved our Tupperware. It's what are we going to do now in 2023 to reduce, to stop. Actually, we have to stop making, but we just have to stop.
We'll start stopping various different things,
Yeah.
you know.
So in order to become exquisitely efficient in how we live on this planet. So I think our goal as educators is to simplify to the extent that people just go, oh, that makes sense. I don't want to answer that question because it's too ugly. Basically, what we do as facilitators of change is put up a mirror. And I could tell you 20 years ago when we started this, people didn't like what they saw. And we worked, and we always kept it very light. Yeah, not very pretty. Hey, okay. What are we going to do about it? And we have to, I think we have to accelerate. We used, accelerated learning techniques. Well, we have to do super acceleration now because the mess is bigger than ever. So how do we accelerate emotion and fun and positivity and optimism? How do we give people hope that there is something on the other side? Because right now we're in a quagmire. And the mental health issue I know is humongous, especially after COVID. But COVID also brought us, we probably wouldn't be meeting today if we didn't have this technology. So, hey.
Let me ask you a question about your encounter with Bucky. So what has been the journey for both of you in terms of your encountering Bucky for the first time, what it was like, what were the major steps, what books spoke to you, what ideas spoke to you, anything that you would like to say about your journey?
All I say now to friends is he so predicted it in Operating Manual in 1969. He so predicted where we are. So we had the joy of listening to him starting we only learned of Bucky in 92, and we bought the in those days, the video cassettes of him. They put him on a stage for a week in Hawaii, and they said, just talk. And that's all he did. He just talked, and they filmed it, and I could get 15 minutes into it. I'm going, I don't have a clue what he's saying. So it was trying to suggested to read this was like, I have my marks, but I really didn't know what I was doing. So, but the part that made sense was nature. The part that made sense, because I'm not mathematically inclined, but the part for me that gave me an appreciation of nature. And then I started reading with that mindset of how is this reflected in nature, and coming to understand that I am nature. And that's one of the biggest shifts we can help people make, because I would imagine most people don't believe that they are nature. Yeah.
John, what about you?
Yeah, for me, it was quite interesting. So we first learned about, earth, air, water, fire for people from ancient Chinese. This is really ancient, like thousands and thousands years ago. And we were kind of looking at people and trying to figure out what element they were. And we found that we weren't very accurate, or we weren't able to be consistent. So I thought, well, maybe it's not that useful. Sometimes people look this way and sometimes they look something else. And then we had this introduction to the tetrahedron. And at that stage, we were before the tetrahedron, we were using DISC, DISC, which is like a simple version of Myers-Briggs. And that had 4 things, and we didn't like the terminology, so we'd use earth, air, water, fire instead of DISC, or the words that they use. And then when I saw the tetrahedron and how Bucky was, raving on about it, it's the way nature works. Wow. And I realized, well, we've got four main types, and we could put them onto the tetrahedron. And for quite a while, I struggled. So we actually called it the 4 elements tetrahedron model, which is too big a mouthful. And yeah, the point was I had a bit of an aha. The book, our book describes it. TetraMap, Develop People and Business the Way Nature Intended. That describes the aha when I've unfolded the TetraMap into the tetrahedron into this shape, and I realized those binary distinctions that I talked about before. That was the major breakthrough. And then I realized it's really just a map. And a map is really just a metaphor for what's out there. And we're using earth, air, water, fire as a metaphor. So maybe we're not even trying to do anything that's actually real or authentic or scientifically proven. It's just a metaphorical structure that helps us make sense. It's not true. I can prove to you conclusively that, the TetraMap psychological model is invalid. There you go, done. It's invalid.
Our marketers hated us saying that.
And eventually but people loved it, and people can relate to it because earth, air, water, fire has no connotations, no negative connotations. It's not one that's better than the other. And you can go so deep with metaphor. So when you're talking about yourself in terms of a metaphor, beside the metaphor, you can talk about this. It's much easier than talking about me. Yeah, so that was the major progression. And then with COVID, everything becoming so complex, and with Space Camp, we're realizing, some of the speakers were saying, we have to let go of our ego and the thought that we actually know what we want, and that what we want is going to be good for the planet. So how do we deal with that? So that's when, so we retained the 3 principles from TetraMap, but we added the precision, which is looking at the effect on the outside context, and that is really more important, what the effect is on the outside context, than what you're doing with whatever you're focusing on. And then how can you let go of desiring a particular tangible outcome and focus more on process.
Relationships.
And it's a little bit like, for us, we're sailors. So this is the name of our boat. It's Japanese for nature, Shizen. It also, if you look at the 2 symbols, it's Shi, meaning 4, Ichi ni san Shi, and Zen, 4 pieces, peaceful, 4 ways. So we've sort of integrated all of that in our lives, over time, and realize that now the world is in a position where we need to be much more eco-conscious and try and develop and more eco-ego.
Wonderful. It's I have to tell you that when CJ conceptualized this project, and CJ is a very deep thinker. He really gets Bucky at a very deep level, and so he said, it's like how he came up with this idea of 4 on-ramps to synergetics. One which is kind of more intuition oriented, where you're trying to get to the whole, fully inspired, fully energized to do that. One which is all about actual design of things, design of physical things. One which is about geometry, which is really heavy on mathematics. And one which is unifying, kind of collaborating with that. So it kind of maps with what you're saying, the four elements. And there is this echo of these 4 elements throughout, because earth, wind, fire, and water, those are very old, and those are there in many, many different traditions. And they speak to us. I mean, the reason that it's like they speak to us. And metaphors are very powerful, because what metaphors does is that you can look at water and you can see how it flows and what it does. So you can use something that you're familiar with to point to something and think about something which you are less familiar with. This is how your mind operates. So it's a very, very powerful tool of doing that. Jung uses that. Jung has this, the colors. That's another thing. So let me ask you about the colors. How did you choose the colors for these 4 things? What are your thoughts about the colors?
Yeah, that's very good. So one of the things I didn't say, but I had it written, was when you're dealing with metaphor, it's not right or wrong, it's just good or, maybe a bit weak. And when you're trying to get 4 metaphors all related, it's really hard to get 4 strong metaphors. So earth, we use brown or black. Pretty obvious. Water, we use blue, of course, and fire, we could use red, of course. So what does that leave? Well, yellow, but that's not a very good color for anything except highlighting. It leaves green. And the way we rationalize the use of green for air is that, it's really the chlorophyll that creates our atmosphere. The green color of trees and plants is what's creating our atmosphere. It's creating the air, and it transforms. The green transforms carbon dioxide into oxygen. So there's lots of ways we can use air as a metaphor. Thinking green. Yeah.
Wonderful. I want to also ask you about the spiral, because I think that's a giant step forward.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah,
think
I
about
would think
things
so too.
that-
It's sort of end of last year.
Oh no, I think it was this year, wasn't it?
And we're in 2023.
Yeah.
In the middle of the month.
I guess. Oh yeah, was it? Yeah, end of last year.
End of last year, right before Christmas.
Very, very recent. Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that, about the spiral. What does spiral do when you engage in a spiral? Because I think it's a very profound idea.
Well, first of all, we realized we wanted to go in a cycle, and then we learned a little bit about spirals, and we thought, well, a cycle can be a spiral. You're just ending up in a different place, and that's what we're doing. So really, we're cycling through the elements, but the effect is a spiral because you're doing different things every time. And one of the things about TetraMap was that this arrangement is very has to work this way. You can't move the elements around to make the model work. And we suddenly thought, well, I guess with our TetraMeme model,
I'll get it.
with the triangle, it's a bit awkward having one thing in the middle. Everything revolves around one thing. Oh, well, why don't we make it a spiral? And that makes it less important. It's a starting point, sure, and then you go around and you come on out, and you expect to start another, and continue the spiral, and you might end up with elements in a different order. And if you think of it as a spiral on a 3D object, I mean, that if you map that particular spiral onto a tetrahedron, when you fold it up, it doesn't really matter which element is where. So that was really kind of a breakthrough for us to realize that one of the benefits of this shape is that we can or the TetraMeme concept is that you can put the elements wherever you like, and you can, you could actually do TetraMeme, unfold TetraMeme in this format if you wanted to, or you could do it in this format, which is actually different. Whereas TetraMap doesn't translate from here to there. Can't do it.
So we bought back from the business, TetraMap International, we bought back our second iteration on the Tetra.
Original graphic.
See, this is 2002. I can't even remember.
That's the original graphic.
Oh,
That's
it's the
not
original.
second, the
Oh,
first.
this is the original graphic. So we got this back to use for TetraMeme. So
I
it
don't
comes
use that
full
one
circle.
anymore.
Mm.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I mean, this is really, really fascinating, and I'm just delighted that you guys could come and talk about this. Would you like to have you have the last word? So what would you like to say to the audience?
Oh, I'd like to say thank you for letting us just spout off here, because we're learning. We just integrated the concept of spiral at the end of last year. So
This is
we want you to be part of our development team, because it's going to make the difference that we all need to make. It's going to help us all make the difference we want to make, I think.
Yeah, I think one
thank
of the things we did in our training for TetraMap is we always, for training the trainers, was we said, when you do this, you will learn more than your participants. And so we thank you very much for this, because we've learned so much from you all.
Your questions are wonderful.
Yeah, wonderful
Thank you so
questions, and
Makes us
yeah,
think.
brilliant. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. So folks, I want to tell you about amazing things coming up. Next up is going to be Kirby Erner, and he's going to take us into a deep dive into synergetics. So get ready, folks, get ready. And when Kirby means deep, I think it's going to be deep. So he has got this amazing set of slides that are coming up, and there's lot of amazing people who are coming up very soon. So it's going to be Kirby. That's going to be on January 29th. That's going to be followed by Kurt McNamara. And he's going to be talking about, he's writing a book on Bucky's comprehensivity. So he's going to be going through, that as applied to Bucky's design. That's going to be on February 5th. Christopher Zelov is going to be here. He's a filmmaker who has done extensive work on Bucky, and he's going to show us some of the rare footage of Bucky working with his designs and many other things. Next up is going to be Doug Jacobs, D.W. Jacobs. He's the one who has written the one-man play on Bucky, and he's going to be talking about, I don't know how to pronounce it, dramaturgical synergies. So how do synergies work in drama? What really makes a drama work? And using the synergetic principles, he started with the idea of I'm a verb, but he's going to apply it to drama as such. Next, and that's going to be February 19th. Next, Robert Sandusky is going to be back, and he's going to be talking about Bucky's design science and the 4 on-ramps idea that CJ has. Next, we're going to have an open session, and I'm going to keep doing these ones, and that's going to be lightning talks. So anybody is welcome to talk for 5 minutes on any theme on Bucky. And I encourage everybody to do that. It doesn't matter what, if whether you spend all your life studying Bucky or you're new to it, we would love to hear what you have to say. So we'll have a whole bunch of presentations, 5-minute presentations, and then we will have discussions on all of that. Next up is going to be Rupali Sharma, and she's going to be looking at the education ideas of Bucky and Maria Montessori. There is a lot of commonalities in that. So that's going to be on March 12th. And then finally, not last and not least, because we're going to be doing this for 2 years. This is only the beginning of 100 meetups. And at the rate at which we are going, I think it is going to end up being closer to 150 or 200 in these 2 years. It's going to be Richard Ramsey here talking about social tensegrity. That's going to be on March 26th. And many folks are about to sign up to do more sessions. So really appreciate that. So thank you very much, everybody. Really appreciate it. And thanks, Yoshimi. Thanks, John. Let's go ahead and put the site. I think Joe has put the site in tetrameme.com. Let's see, Joe, could you just copy and paste the site again? Okay, there is the email addresses, yoshimi@tetramap.com and john@tetramap.com. The URL is tetramap.com. So thank you very much, everybody. See you folks soon. Bye, everybody.